As we start with the day two of the event, I once again welcome all the dignitaries, guests, and the delegates. I hope everyone is completely pepped up for the very interesting learning session from the eminent speakers across the country lined up for you. As we know, this time's Young Architects Festival has a theme of rethink, restore, and reconnect. We start with the first session, that is Rethink. And to introduce the session, I would like to call upon stage architect Mangesh Prabhugaukar, IA Council member. Please introduce the session to us, sir.
Good morning, Honorable President of IIA, office bearers, National Council members, Team Jharkhand, members of the Architects Fraternity, and all my friends. It's my great pleasure to be here among the young professionals at this Young Architects Festival, wherein you all will experience some of the wonderful works that happen among architectural fraternity in the country. At this juncture, as we all know, architects think very often during their process in design. However, the focus of this session highlights on the current practices, prevailing challenges, and the newer normal way of life, especially post-COVID pandemics that has occurred now. IIA Jharkhand has appropriately addressed the theme on rethink, reconnect, and restore. Architecture practice on one side, architecture education on the other side. It's a question now, do we wait for the new way of teaching or pedagogies in architecture, the way forward policies of upcoming national education policy for newer direction towards futuristic emerging trends and demands of architecture education and architecture profession in the digital world? The forum today is focusing on rethink. The question here to the architects fraternity is, rethink on what? Multi-dimensional layers that makes architecture is something we think in today's date, or we rethink on, or do we strategize on multifaceted stakeholders ranging from architects, allied professionals, engineers, policymakers, and masses and beyond towards the emerging trends of architectural vocabulary which is in the country today. At this session, as we all have respected speakers and architects fraternity, deliberate various aspects of architecture and planning focus on art, humanities, socio-cultural identities of the country, architectural identities in terms of vocabularies, construction technologies of the traditional times, with a huge past of context-based vernacular practices. The war between built and natural environment with a consolidated sensitive approach is something which needs a rethink at this forum in today's contemporary world in digital era of softwares, of automation-based, app-based engineering wired models over our build form. At this juncture, a rethink is something needs a appropriate strategy. Are we here with an appropriate direction in our design skills? Are the policy makers around us considering our recommendations and getting them integrated and incorporated within the regulations and laws of the land through the acts? Is the process of making resilient designs, are we thinking on socio-economic aspects and that formulate levels of affordability, which is a big challenge in today's date? What we as architects strategize and conceptualize and what gets socially acceptable when we build is the area of focus of rethink at this session. Primarily the emerging architectural identities in regional context and across the country in both urban and rural sector is a question towards then, present and future since liberation times. Young architects here have the challenging power to change, to adapt to a change and to accept a change via this rethink process which you will witness very soon. Pattern of architecture education as on today, challenging task of digital era for the future, integrated design concept of climate responsive architecture, along with socially responsible and buildable limits and guidelines. IIA, with a huge history of more than 100 years with our resources, huge database, can introspect and facilitate the process of rethink. Can or should architects stay with the structural limits which are defined within an envelope, or open up newer thought processes exploring the current and upcoming architectural typologies post-pandemics needs a rethink with time in today's date. Behavioral patterns around architectural build form by user groups and whether it's respected in a transformation of space, scale, and sequence needs a rethink. Ecosystem restoration demands a rethink. Are we thinking on current energy resources or inventing alternative forms of energy for user-friendly and environment-friendly sensitive policies in today's date in our architectural practice? It's time to deliberate on newer challenges. Post-pandemics beyond 2020 has demanded a change and a rethink. Does build form revolve around our health, or health of user group dictates the build form is a question to create resilient design in today's date. Let's begin this session at Young Architects Festival 21 and with a focus on rethink. I appreciate efforts of Team Jharkhand with Sandeep's leadership. Best wishes to the forum who has the power to change via deliberations on rethink. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for introducing the session to us. Moving ahead, we will start with our first speaker of the day, that is architect Akshay Hiranjal, Principal, Purple Ink Studio. Purple Ink Studio, established in the year 2011 in Bengaluru, the Purple Ink Studio is a multifaceted architecture practice that is young, experimental and ambitious. Conceived by Aditi Pai and Akshay Hiranjal as the principals, along with Nishita Bhatia, the studio has now grown into a highly collaborative practice with a core group of design associated who come from different architectural backgrounds. The practice passionately believes in an approach that is layered, contextual, and experimental in nature. The studio is exploring various scales and typologies with a constant search to engineer new ways of blurring the boundaries between architecture and landscape. With a highly personalized approach, every project undertaken is process-driven, typically by a close-knit team that would see the project through its totality. Sir, we request you to kindly come forward to start the session.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's an honor to be here. So, I've got 30 minutes. I was told 20, so I've got 10 extra minutes now. But I'm going to stick to my time. First of all, honor to be here, and looking forward to taking you all through some of our works with a fantastic description on the idea of rethink, which aptly symbolizes so much, that's necessary in the kind of context that we're living in right now. I hope through our works, maybe even 5% of what you said is sort of culminating. I hope it comes down to some sort of a process that helps everyone see it. So I'm going to start off with a small video. So this is sort of what we do as well. So as a practice, it's a set of 20 people who are extremely passionate, deeply mad about what we do. And over the last 10 years of our practice, we've been fortunate enough to work on multiple things, juggle a lot of things, and ultimately find a way to put these all together in a way which starts looking like it's pretty balanced. But the kind of journey that goes behind it is crazy, it's mad. A highly passionate set of people, fully into what we do. I'm going to run you all through 4 projects that sort of talk about different perspectives, different context, different scales as well. Starting from the smallest project, and like we know, each project or each studio, each setting that you live in has a story. So four different stories, if I can put it together in that sense. This was one of our smallest project that we started off with a couple of years ago, where the client actually came down from Saudi and said, he wanted to come back to Mangalore, which is in the coastal part of Karnataka, and had a lot of memory with his upbringing there, with the brick factories and the area where he lived in. So although he could afford a larger place, he was extremely keen that we look at a place which is very, very close to where he used to live. So the entire setting was done in such a way that you had multiple things all around. So all that you could look at is find ways to open up to the sky and connect to the earth at different levels. So tight-knit site, concealed from all the sides except where you open only to the sky. The rest of the things that start coming together is this sort of a skin that comes out, which actually started building the story. So when you have a setting, when you have multiple things happening around, and the only thing that's available on the outer side where you could look out, but then that also starts to appear that the kind of vision that you have has other people looking inwards, then you start finding ways to tackle that. So that's where the whole idea of these bricks started coming in. So when you start looking at a process, we sort of build it through this initial foray of initial imagery that we start off with, which then started getting on into detail, where every layer, every area started finding its own way, and every brick started telling its own story. So the kind of layering that was required for this project started finding its own way, and there were multiple hands that were collaborating together to find its own aspect onto the kind of direction and the kind of views that you would want to have, sometimes conceal, sometimes reveal, sometimes just work as a veil. So this was a project which actually allowed us to explore bricks in its in a way where it was a 3-layered format. Laterite being the first layer, which became the source of the whole structure. Then you had bricks on the outer periphery, which started working around the kind of layering that was required, and the inner brick started doing its own thing. So each brick actually started finding its own way, started having its own story. And this was the first set of workings that we did, running you all through a few of the images and the kind of connect that you would have with the sky. The kind of layering also made it important for us to understand the kind of lifestyle that the client had. So the client would actually come down to Mangalore twice a month, thrice a month. So other times of the year, the house had to sort of conceal itself. So this whole idea of the bricks starting to play around had to sort of address those two issues where you don't know whether the client is at home or not. So that kind of a situation. So when you start looking at the way the brick started forming its own patterns and its own typologies, we started finding multiple ways to put these together. One of the things that we do as a part of our process is hand modeling, which is been around in our studio from the day we started, and a lot of the explorations happen on this scale although I think we know who's here, who's explored brick and other materials to its finest potential. For us, being in Bangalore, we have our limitations with resources in a way where you can't do mock-ups, etc., being in another city, etc. So everything that we do is hand-modeled in the studio, multiple people working on it, lesser time, too much pressure, but we don't give up on this. So this was one of the times when I think we put in 15-20 days of massive man hours to sort of put together every single layer of the brick and sort of start finding ways to build it, and also start finding ways to foresee any problems that you would have. Then it went on to the next level where we started rendering them to sort of understand the kind of feel that would come out of it. And all that you see was all done in first cut, and this is how we actually present to the clients as well. So what you see is exactly what we put across to the client, and then the whole experimentation started happening on site. The entire project in fact doesn't have any paint inside out. Everything was done in brick, plastered finishes, concrete textures, and whatnot maybe. The scale, although was not very large, but the kind of expertise that was required was also sort of worked out with the local guys there. We didn't have a special team that would come down from somewhere else. So those guys had to be trained. We had to work with them inside out to understand the kind of layering that each brick had to go through. Each brick actually started looking into different directions. Everything was done in multiple ways to sort of understand how it would react. So that's the first project where the layerings were done in multiple variations, from modeling to computer modeling to hand model to site, etc., etc. The next project is something that's actually close to my heart. Vanam was a sort of a builder-driven project. In Bangalore, when we are doing multiple projects, you sort of stray away from projects where it is developer-driven or builder-driven for multiple reasons. But we realized that the kind of potential that the city has would start losing its charm if you start looking at only projects that you really want to do and start shying away from these projects which are sort of not something that you would want to get into on a regular basis. The kind of context that this project was also allowed us to see how much of the greens had actually reduced, and the kind of lake reduction in the size of the lake is also quite evident in the last 10-15 years. So we took this up as a challenge and said, what happens if we start looking at the small housing which is for only 20 units and see if there can be more greens grown as a part of the built form rather than just the building being on the the building being built and the greens on the outer periphery. Because most of the projects that you get in Bangalore are actually quite tight in terms of the smaller context. Larger context, of course, you have a lot of green space that you could play with. So the process involved in this was to understand how the greens can become a part of the built form itself. So instead of looking at normal balconies that would allow you to move out, we said, why don't we start staggering it and start finding ways for the soil to become a part of it, so that the greens become a part of the built form itself, and then it starts forming its own layers. So that's how the whole form started evolving out of it, which eventually also found ways to find productive greens that can become a part of it. We also did a lot of calculations to understand the kind of greens that every family would require and allow people with similar mindsets to come down and be a part of it. It was also an experiment on multiple levels. One was with the extreme tight budget and the contractors who probably never explored different possibilities or variations to see how they would react to it with the very limited budget that we had. A simple problem of even reusing the material had to be thought of, which we used in another project. With the tight constraints, it was also understandable that the time limitations were also there. With those sort of ideas, to find the right set of people and to start coming together as a community was more important for us. These were during the construction phase. Again, a lot of explorations done with low-cost materials that would actually, allow the builder to or the developer to sort of not cut across anywhere or cut corners anywhere. This building was completed about a year and a half back, and for us it became a very important aspect to see how people react and how people maintain, because it's important for people to understand that when you say you want greens inside your house or as a part of the community that you live in, you should be willing to give back and do whatever is required. So we've been tracking it for a period of 1.5 years to see how the whole space is reacting, and are all the greens actually there. Because beyond a point, it's difficult for the developer or the whole community to come together and maintain it. And also the kind of planning that we did was so open-ended that it allowed people to use it for multiple things inside. One of the units which we designed and sort of opened ourselves up to was this one which we called Shunyo, which is part of the same project. A few learnings from that project was that we realized when people say they want green and they get it, they are not really compelled to, sort of do that little extra effort. So we've realized over time of, things that can be put across to people who really, really want to do it, and it is possible to do that. And if every project, can start looking at greens to be a part of their build forms, there are multiple ways to check the way the land use is being read. So that was an experiment for us, and now as a practice we are doing multiple projects where green is becoming a stronger part of the build forms, and we are not afraid to do projects that are commercially driven or developer driven and yet find our own way within it. This third typology is basically a project that came to us in fact again in Mangalore, surprisingly, and where the client was extremely keen to sort of have a community driven project, but at the same time find ways to get revenue out of it. It was a 5.5 acre property on the Mangalore-Surathkal highway, where the requirement of a community center was planned with a set of convention halls and places where you could have banquets and things like that to sort of help drive the economics for that particular zone. It was a pretty large parcel of land where you had requirements for a 3,000 capacity unit. What started off was with the idea of coming together of couple of convention areas. Started with the whole concept of looking at a 8-pointed star or a octagonal form that sort of evolved from our initial workings of symbolism and a lot of other layerings that I'm not showing here. The entire process then culminated onto layering in 2 different parcels, where the lower part was being used for banqueting and food, etc., and the upper levels is where you start walking up to the main convention zones. A lot of the explorations for us happened in this project through the materiality, because although larger in size, we had to find our own way to sort of look at materials that are still perforated, something that allows the light to fall through, and something that allows you to connect to the outside, which is typically not possible in events like these where everything is covered and closed. the material play was actually quite simple, with laterite forming the base, and it starts getting lighter on the top. So you've got a combination of steel, bamboo, tensile and the laterite coming together. The material play initially, which started off with the initial working, started getting more and more complex once we started detailing them. And this was a project that we won 2 years back, a year and a half, 2 years back. It was a competition project for the School of Architecture in Manipal. I would take a little more time on this, and that's why the previous projects were a little, driven fast. This was the site, and it was a fantastic site to, sort of even get an opportunity to work on. There was a dip of about 18 meters from the topmost to the lowermost site, which also meant that the kind of layering that had to happen had to be so strong and important that it would not defeat the land use. If the building was not built, it should have the same sort of effect when the building is built, because the whole wind direction that you would have, the kind of daily movement of wind and even the rainfall or the water had to be addressed. So that became the first set of workings for us to understand how to react to this project. Also, the kind of culture that is so strong in Manipal, Mangalore, Udupi areas, we sort of started finding our ways to layer ourselves in and add 1 or 2 new materials. There was a lot of working done in terms of the layering of the whole build form. So these are sort of derivatives of that, where a lot of working actually sort of had to be detailed out right in the beginning, because it was a touch and go. So if you didn't get the project, it's right, you're cut off right there. The process started off with, finding the kind of, the understanding the slope first, then the whole story comes together. Because of the valley effect, the moment you see it from the other side, you realize that you don't want to overbuild and sort of overpower on the other side. So the whole stepped sort of formations became very important, and then the whole idea of what do you do when you get these step formations and how do you connect the classrooms to that became a story in itself. So the idea was to give each studio the possibility of being able to open out and then have access to all these studios through a singly loaded open sort of a walkway rather than a corridor, and also allow people to go directly into the stepped court rather than going through the classroom or the studio itself. So the journey of being able to walk through multiple classrooms, if yours is on the topmost layer, you would actually know what is happening in all the studios as well, was the first idea that we started off with. Then the next set of working was to sort of find additional, sort of these interaction spaces or breakout spaces for studios that didn't have that stepped classroom. That's how this came together. Then the working that you see from the other side of the valley, the moment you open, the extreme weather conditions in Manipal is so strong that you either have too much rain or too much sun. So the entire working that you see now is sort of reacting to that with a lot of vertical fins to cut down on the heat gain. Add these light shelves which allows light to come in. And this is how the area of the stepped court started coming together. The same thing happens on the other side with it reacting to the winds on a different direction again. The stepped courts become a very important part of the whole campus, and also made sure that the kind of wind direction now is still maintained. So this was an extremely important factor for us to sort of stick to from the beginning till the end. Then the rest of the things came together. It was a pretty long process. I think we had about 600 slides when we put them together for the first presentation. But everything had to find its own meaning, including the sort of entry that you get into the whole campus. This is the first thing that you see when you enter the district of Udupi, which is the main entrance gateway and the Krishna temple there. A couple of things that we started finding meaning was when we started abstracting the kind of openings there, started finding ways to sort of connect that to the place here, because 80% of the people who study in Manipal are NRIs, or people who haven't had the clue of the culture of the city itself. So that's how that thing started coming in, and the rest of the things started falling in place with the kind of details that we started working on. So the idea was also to make sure that it's a 6-storied building, but what you see in the front is just a 3-storied building, and then it slowly starts opening out when you walk in. And that's the extreme end, which is part of the valley. The step courts. The studios that actually open out on 2 sides in most of the cases. And this was actually a very large project, considering you don't need such large spaces for architecture schools, but the requirement was for 1,400 students, 1.5 lakh square feet of built up, which also had interiors and fashion design as a part of it. So we had to find multiple ways for the central court also to become extremely active, because you either have fantastic views of the valley, or when you look in, you have the whole beautiful court which becomes extremely active on the inner side. The top terraces are also being planned for productive greens. Contextually, the idea of not to reveal the whole building was extremely important. That's why you just see the front 3 stories in the beginning, and then when you start walking down, you see the entire expanse of the campus. And these are pictures that you see now, which is under construction. We have another year, to finish the whole project. Massive steps, fantastic views of the valley for people who are working there. And this is where we've reached so far. And just to end this, I have to tell you that all these 4 projects that you saw were all done during the same time with just 8 people in the office. This was over a period of a year when there were about 25-30 projects that we were doing at one point of time. Slowly we've scaled up, we are about 25 now. And the kind of work that went into each project was massive, hand done in a lot of cases with models and things like that. And each context, each layering, each scale, typology was all extremely different. So that's our story, and that's how we've looked at, putting it across to all of you. I hope I've made some difference to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Architect Akshay Hiranchal. It was a very precise and enlightening presentation. I'm sure all of us in the hall could relate to his work and learned how to work in details. We'll have the question and answer round at the end of this session. I would now like to welcome our next guest speaker. We are extremely honored to welcome Architect Madhav Raman from Anagram Architects. Madhav is an architect and urbanist. He co-founded Anagram Architects in partnership with Vaibhav Dimri after they graduated from the School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi in 2001, formally established in 2004. He has presented talks at many prestigious forums, including the Thomas Memorial Lecture Series at Cornell University, New York, the Spring Lecture Series at RIBA London, the Planning Commission's midterm appraisal of the 11th five-year plan, and the Urban Mobility India. Keenly involved in academia, Madhav conducts a design studio at the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, where he has also guided dissertations, seminars, and research papers. He writes regularly for the Architectural Digest and the Times of India, in addition to being published in the Bauhaus magazine, Architecture, Design Boom, and Arch Daily. Now I request Architect Madhav to please come up on the stage and take the dais. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'd like to thank the leadership at IIA for reviving, I believe, the Youth Architecture Festival. Not a moment too soon. I honestly feel can no longer be called, can no longer represent anything of any form that is youthful in architecture. But I think that's really speaking all that is left to hope for. So I've titled today's lecture Closer Apart. It seems odd, but we live in strange times. So it's perhaps time we start thinking or rethinking, as is the theme of this session, on what it means to work in strange times where it seems like crisis is upon us and where universes seem to collide, world doesn't seem to work in the way it's meant to. Building resilience through disaggregation. So let's start at the beginning. So this is my reference to youthfulness. It goes back 20 years. This is how Vaibhav and I met in college in 96, wherein amongst the many things that we got up to in college was not just architecture but also theatre. Jha Sahab is here. He is the founding father of our theatre society in college, Spandan. And then from that friendship that formed while doing theatre together, we decided to start practice together. It's been 20 years. And the only thing that's changed in our friendship has been my hairstyle. But while we were growing closer and getting together to start practice, the world around us was changing. So in the same period of time, if you think back, in 1989, around the beginnings of the 90s when we first met, there were about 174 countries if you open the atlas. By 2000, this had increased to 195, essentially because the USSR broke up, Yugoslavia, all these sort of places. And now if you Google, if you find out online, there are actually 250 country internet domains. So these also include countries that are not recognized by the UN. And they all exist together in a virtual universe, which is not very different from the political universe that we see around ourselves. So where do we find ourselves today as a practice, as people, as part of the entire planet? We find that we are post-globalized. Honestly, COVID is just an extreme culmination of a process of post-globalization that has happened over the past decade or so. You see evidence of this in various ways, which I'll get into. We are hyper-connected. So while we are post-globalized, we are connected in more and more deeper ways, in more and more visceral ways, where someone sitting in one part of the world can instigate a violent reaction in another part of the world. And we are quite truly and honestly climate changed. I think the time where we used to speak about climate change as a distant future is over. This monsoon is evidence of it. The last monsoon was evidence of it. The periods between monsoons when we in Delhi at least wear anti-smog masks are also evidence of it. So what exactly is this evidence? So firstly, for a post-globalization, we see this evidence in a sort of what I call rude diplomacy, where, you know, at a time when parents wanted us to sit for IAS exams, we were told the IFS was all about diplomacy, of being able to convince, form alliances, and to try and work towards common goals. But now we find that that is kind of shifted. It's become a rude diplomacy. It's all about ethnic nationalism. It's all about economic nationalism. And it's all about ecological nationalism. The last one is the most hidden. And that is where a form of nationalism where you feel you own something that is not human, that is natural, that is part of the environment. For example, of late, there's a massive problem with the Amazons because Brazil feels that it owns the Amazons and it should be able to exploit the Amazons as it should. Or if Bangladesh was supposed to talk about Sundarbans that way. These are situations that are coming up more and more, and all of us who work with built habitation have to face this in various ways, where ecological systems that are not within the territorial constraints of a country actually deeply impact the climate of that. So the bigger problem is not whether the farms of Pakistan are burning their rice paddy for us to get smog. The bigger problem is why do farms need to burn rice paddy stubble. connected silos. So hyper-connected, but we are connected in completely insulated silos. So there's evidence of this in what is popularly known as gated communities or gated living. What's strange is it's not just the super rich who are gating themselves away. More and more, even within cities, inner cities, within slums, people are actively ghettoizing, actively becoming more and more insular, whether it's communally based or income group based or what have you. Whereas the world operates through free trade zones. So large amounts of economic value are transferred across oceans through entities that exist territorially within countries but are outside the legal framework of that country. So these are special economic zones or free trade zones. And of course, we all know how completely insular online groups can be. So whether it's Facebook, whether it's WhatsApp, or whether it's the Wi-Fi connection hotspot that you have at your local Starbucks or Cafe Coffee Day. These are all connected silos. We feel we are more connected, but we are actually hyper-connected. The third is ecological breakdowns. So we are climate change. So what that means is we are removing resources at a unimaginably evil scale from the ground. So we are depleting resources. We are burning those resources and taking all that and putting it into our atmosphere. So we are creating atmospheric pollutions. This causes water cycle mayhem. So what we are seeing every monsoon repeat itself out is actually complete toss-up of the water cycle across the globe. And this eventually results in biodiversity loss. So these are our 4 critical human-caused, human-created, and now human-experienced climatic breakdowns. But today, architecture is a world of heroes and icons, of global thought leaders. So while we were growing up, Sir Foster was considered the ultimate in urban architecture. Followed very closely behind him was Zaha Hadid, and of late it is Byak. And what's common to all of them is actually the same categories. So we are more global, so it doesn't matter where we build. What we build is something that looks exactly the same, behaves exactly the same way, induces the same behaviors. We are high-tech. As architecture sees itself, we consider ourselves high-tech. But that technology is, again, a connection of silos. We all operate in silos, and we connect with ourselves, not very differently from these conventions. And we imagine we are progressing, but we are actually hyper-connected within bubbles. And of course, we are cool. I've worn cool shoes today. So we like to imagine that we are setting trends, we are at the cutting edge, but all these things come in a bracket that we are urban. And that's fundamentally how Indian architecture also sees itself, as an urban practice. But urbanization in this country is not such a happy story. It's not cool. It's in fact very uncool. Because urbanization in this country for the past 150, as long as the IIA has been around, is actually deruralization. And it's deruralization under great distress. People don't come to cities to hunt for opportunities. They come to cities because they're trying to escape death in villages. And that is the fundamental truth of India's urbanization. So it's deruralization by exodus, by mass exodus. And this creates 3 categories of people who I feel, when we are rethinking, we must start thinking of as our clientele. These are ethnic refugees, these are climatic refugees, and these are livelihood refugees, the so-called urban migrant. It's strange to be called a migrant within your own country. So I prefer to call it a livelihood refugee because you're seeking refuge from a point of extreme distress. It's not a happy urbanization. NASA keeps producing nighttime shots of India. We all love them. It is beautiful. But what does this represent about the people who live on this land? So when we started practice, way back in 2000, day before yesterday, we inoculated or gave 1 billion doses of the COVID vaccine. It's a time to celebrate. In 2000 was a time to celebrate that we crossed 1 billion in population. It was considered, we were a young country, full of hope. In 2000, we were hoping to see great things happen in this country, as we still do now. But there was this idea that we had a demographic dividend, that a large population was somehow to our advantage. And that kind of goes against the antithesis of what we've been taught, that, density is a problem, overpopulation is a problem, our cities are irreparable because there's so many people in it, it's unmanageable. But how does that sit square with the idea that the human resource we have in this country is our greatest advantage? Today, we've added a third more, we have 1.35. And in 2040, in another 20 years, we would have added 50% more to that 1 billion. But if you look at the right, that's our contribution to world population. So, if in 2000 we were 16%, we've only increased our contribution to world population by 1%. And in another 20 years, we're actually going to drop down to a level we were pre-2000. So, it's not only stable, we are actually going to start dropping. And truth be known, by 2060, we're going to be a declining population. So it's important to understand what and who are we really speaking building for. Sorry, do I have to point it somewhere else? Oops, sorry. One second. Yeah. So, cities and villages in this country are not a binary. They never have been. They're a gradation. So, it is my thesis that we don't live in cities and villages. India does not live in its villages. It lives in its almost cities. India will not live in its cities. It is going to live in its almost villages. So, for us as an urban practice, we have to understand the texture of the cities and villages and settlements we are building in. And this is a small graphic with very easily accessible data. So if you look at it, actually the growth of urban India over the next 20 years is actually going to be in the cities that are going to grow from 40 in 2000 to 71 today to 94. These are all going to become cities. These are your census towns, your tier 3 towns, the so-called tier 4. It's a gray area because it overlaps with large villages, market towns, so on and so forth, below that line that we consider is urban and rural. In 2040, we will be almost 50% each, but it's actually not 50% in two separate categories. What it means is, in 2040, most of India is going to live in that gray patch. And that is where architecture has to build. Please notice that the growth from 2 cities that were 10 million and more in 2000, we only go to 7 cities that are 10 million and more in 2040. So the big cities are not where architecture is happening or is going to happen. It's really speaking going to happen in that gray area in your cities that have below 3 lakh population, 5 lakh population, 10 lakh population. And I believe a large number of you are from those towns and practice there. So a closer look at the gorgeous image of India at night. And you notice that electrification doesn't happen in small spots. Electrification is also graded, which is what I mean, that there is a diffusion of there is a sort of disaggregation and diffusion of things like electricity, water supply, sewage systems. And that is the context that we have to deal with, and that is the context that we have to have answers for. So this is a typical story. We are all familiar with how how small towns urbanize into large cities, small villages become towns, small census towns become district headquarters. It starts off with a fortification, a Laldora, a settlement that is rural, that is based on collections of communities living together. It moves on to, over the next 20 years, that same land, the agricultural land, gets acquired, gets notified, a master plan is put into place, various sectors are made, so-called development through roads is put into place. And what you end up happening is the transect from the city of Delhi to what I consider as the closest form of pure nature near Delhi is the Himalayas. So if you take a satellite image, you can see the gradations, the same fractalized settlements, very, very apparent. It's a very, very thin line where a city ends and a village starts. And that thin line is actually like a big black marker line. It's not thin, it's thick. So 25 to 30% of all Indian cities are formal. They have a master plan, they have piped sewage, they have piped electricity, piped water, and they look like this. But 70 to 75% of our cities, next, actually look like this. These are both photos of a place in Delhi called Dwarka. It was taken while landing in Delhi. They both exist at the same time, and this is what I meant by fractalized settlements. It's not that these are sharply divided communities, they're all intermixed with each other, and that's the context of architecture today. Next, please. So I like to call Delhi the big cheese, because as a master plan, it covers only parts of Delhi. There are lots of holes in the master plan where it doesn't apply. It's also, I mean, the big cheese is also because Delhi at times is all about the clout of money and how big a cheese you are in Delhi. But as we've discovered over the past 10 years, it's also the big V's. So I stopped driving about 4 years back, 5 years back. I only cycle. And one of the things that you'll see me walk around with this mask is a mask that I didn't buy for COVID. I bought it 4 years back for the pollution. And that's because this entire belt from Punjab to Bengal is beginning now, after the monsoons, is going to become a smoke bomb. And that's the air that we all build in, that's the air we all live in, and that's what we have to consider as our context. So I'll start with various ideas pulled from various projects. The first idea is about building at borders. So the more and more our cities are fractalized, almost cities, we will find that we don't have pristine land or clear land to deal with. There is always a question of building at a border of some kind. And how do you build that border? So this is our first building. Way back in 2006, it was completed. It's located at this edge of a formal colony called Safdarjung Enclave in Delhi, as it sits against what most people consider as a slum, but is actually an old settlement of 700 years old. It's a formal settlement, 700 years old, called Humayunpur. The planners at DDA decided not to deal with the problem of sticking a formal colony next to an informal colony, and therefore they built a community green between them. But that community green is a no man's land. No one goes there, no one uses it. It's not like the kids of the urban village play with the kids of the colony. In fact, what we found was that that edge, that red line, that's the path leading past the formal colony into the informal colony. And that's a part where very often, because the people living in Humayunpur, the 700-year-old urban village, don't have refrigerators very often. You pick up fresh vegetables from street vendors who line up. They always have arguments with the colony about parking and who should put their vending cart where. The police have the run of the place because they pick up money from both sides. And this is basically the context that we had. It was at the very corner of this border. So our first idea was to think about how you could create some level of empathy through movement. So if you could align your staircase in a direction in which each time you climb the stairs, each time you're outside a room, you are parallel to the movement on the street. That increases the idea of eye contact. So this was one of the factors. The second factor was this was also the southwest side. So this building needed to be protected, as it's true with all early projects. Most of you young architects will know, clients don't have budgets, and you need to think of ways of reducing their air conditioning costs, lighting costs, so on and so forth. So eventually we got into this. We were fresh out of college. We said, okay, we'll make a brick wall, and this will be the spectacular brick wall. And we just learned, SketchUp had just come out with its first version. So we made course-by-course drawings and then made SketchUp models, and then we went to site, and we realized we'd never in our 5 years actually learned how a brick wall was built. That it's impossible to build a wall like this in the way we imagined it would be built. So it actually took a very, very humbling set of lessons from the masons on site. And this is something we realized for the first time, that we can't build architecture until you're specifying in a way in which the people who are going to build your buildings are going to be able to build it. So it doesn't matter whether you have to make drawings, videos, do a theatrical production in front of them. It doesn't matter. The idea is, as architects, we are communicators of specifications, and those specifications have to be executable on the ground in a sensible way. And that is our first big lesson that we really learned through practice. I don't want to show you too much of this because I think many speakers have much better versions of this brick jali, but just the only excuse I can ask for is this is before really we had 3D SketchUp software to play around with. But essentially the idea of also that brick walls are not made so much by putting bricks together, but also thinking about what it means to remove bricks. Very often we think of ideas of building as constructing, of putting together material, of creating spaces by assembling things. But very often material actually demands that you start imagining ways of removing material from a structure. So these are various houses. The second, sorry, not various houses, various views of SAHRDC. Light, shadow, the protection against the sun, the idea that a texture can somehow convey empathy. So if you look at every other house, sorry, which is the pointer here, the big button in the middle? Yeah, okay, got it. So if you look at that side, most houses had windows facing this green, windows facing the southwest side, but they were always shut. They in fact had black tape on it. So then windows are expensive. So what's the point of building windows if you're not going to open them? And the idea was that actually the formal colony was fortifying itself away from the village. They didn't like them, they didn't want them. But the day-to-day work of buying vegetables, selling vegetables was happening on the street. So the idea that the street corner actually has a non-threatening, non-barbed wire, non-shut window expression actually I think feels better in that corner than any other thing that we could have done for the building itself. So I'll just move to the next project. Yeah, so this is much more recently, about a couple of years back, and this is the second thing to rethink, and this idea of privacies and families when we live. So this is a home that's built in a northwest corner of Delhi. It's at the edge of an industrial area next to a highway. The road in front of this road takes in a lot of truck traffic that goes up and down. It's not very pleasant. But when we build in these houses that are plots in the city, there's always this idea that there's a front facade, and somehow that front facade has always got windows in it. And then as architects, we spend a lot of time designing those volumes and windows and voids and textures and patterns, what we all call facade development. But, you know, actually the idea is we have a very nuanced approach to what privacy means within the family. And this varies from culture to culture, but it also doesn't necessarily fit into the normal BHK arrangement that we imagine apartments have. So this was a family, relatively young man who, through dint of hard work, set up a factory in the industrial estate nearby. He was doing fairly well for himself, had a mother, 2 children, so it's a 3-generational family. But you know, he could have lived anywhere in South Delhi and bought himself a luxury car and driven to the factory every, 1 hour, 1.5 hours, watching something on his iPad. I mean, like all factory owners do, I expect. But I found that it seemed very interesting that he felt he needed to be close to his work. And that again is a sort of a cultural indication. It's not so much that it's like, it's mera dhanda hai, and I have to be near my dhanda, So how do you then create, but equally he's very proud of the money he's made. He wants to show it off. So how do you balance both those things in a place like this? So Cleft was an experiment in removing masks to create a home that was completely introverted, that in ways speaks of opulence, but perhaps a little more loudly, but perhaps more sensibly. For example, we saved a lot of, he was very keen we used Italian marble or imported marble. We actually found that, we ended up using about 1/5 the marble we would have used if it had been used for flooring, by just using it on the facade. And then we were able to use that to modulate the bright sunshine that came through the front of the building. So all the efforts were to be able to create soft, natural light in a naturally ventilated central courtyard, so that the whole family could enjoy, so that the whole family, so the idea, that's why it's called Cleft. It's a broken volume. in many ways, obviously mimicking courtyard living, where rooms look into a courtyard, family connections are made in courtyard. When the meal is ready, people shout to each other through the courtyard to come down and eat. That's the kind of family life that he wanted, because again, it's a 3-generation house. But again, something that spoke about, so by the way, this gentleman makes pet bowls. He's perhaps the second largest pet bowl maker in the world. So he's also globalized. He also has visitors from all over the world. He also wants to show his neighbors, look, this is who I am, this is what I've done. So the idea was not to resort to a exotic traditionalism, was to give the client exactly what he desired, but to try and see whether it was possible to do that, avoiding air conditioners, avoiding tinted glasses, avoiding creating situations of that kind. So the central courtyard, the back windows open up. It creates, through Bernoulli's effect, a sort of a wind tunnel. And all the rooms actually have large windows that open up into this central courtyard. When you get glimpses into each other's lives, and privacies are managed within the family and privacies are kept from the outside. This is a project that we finished in 2015 or 2016. It's called Artrovert. It is part of a development in Greater Noida, which is the longest arm of Delhi outside Delhi. So it comes under Delhi NCR, but it takes about 2 hours to get there. And it's like high-rise apartments in the middle of fields. When we started building, it was unsettled. You know, you had crime and mafia, and that, you know, it's that the so-called Wild West of India. And you know, what this was an artist colony. So can you imagine the kind of disparity between the two contexts? And it's called Kala Dham. And the planners at Noida, for some strange reason, decided to plan the colony of Kala Dham in octagons. Maybe they thought it was more artistic. But what it meant was we ended up with strange trapezoidal shaped pieces of land. Trapezoidal pieces of land. Problem again, southwest side is the larger side, back side is the narrower side. Our client was Anita Dubey, who's an artist, who is not an artist who makes particularly pretty pictures. Her art is more to do with asking difficult questions, including one which he asked for us for this is, why must I be all by myself and create art in a cave? Which is what I had assumed, that artists want caves to make art and then hold exhibition in museum. So she is of the very firm belief that art is actually in the making of the art, not in the viewing of it, and that the viewing of art should be as democratically accessible as possible, that it should not be locked into museums. That's her fundamental belief. In a later project, I'll tell you, she was the curator of the Kochi Biennale, which is, so her basic curatorial theme was also to be able to open up art to the people. So we started with this idea that why does a building close itself? And what if a building was to open itself up? Why must openings in the building only operate in plan? Why don't they operate in section? Why don't we have a vertical unfurling of a building rather than a horizontal unfurling of a building? And what is the possibilities of that? So it's the trapezoidal plot that made us think of squishing the building and then unrolling it like you get when you sharpen a pencil and the scroll that you get out of it. So this idea was that there is a gray concrete loop, there is a ceramic loop, and they are supported by a armature of steel, which I'll get to the reasons for that. This was also a way of negotiating the climatological context. So the front, the widest part, has the most amount of light, but also has the most amount of heat. So that's where we stacked a lot of thermal mass, but we staggered them so that light could come in indirectly. One of the loops was in high contrast with the other loop, materially and through color, so that you get a lot of bounce light between the two surfaces. And the side that has the armature is actually the side which is very narrow alley before the next building, and that was actually where all the wind would collect, because that's where all the wind in these octagonal shapes would actually get squished through. So the idea was to create wind captures through that tunnel, from that tunnel. So these are views of the inside. That paneling on the back end you see of the picture on the left is the cement board paneling on the steel structure. The floor above, this is the topmost floor which has the residence of the architect, the artist. Anita feels that she wants this to be her legacy building, so that she wants this to host residencies after she finishes her time on this earth, but at least her time in this building. So it's a studio space, multi-level. Even within the studio, the idea is to be able to see art from different heights, different perspectives, from inside, from outside. And while you're an artist making art here, you're constantly aware of what's happening outside the building. Because of the unfurling, we were able to create thermal stacks. So you'll see there are grills on the floor here that actually allow the hot air to escape. So this is a building in Delhi that has no air conditioning. In the basement and ground floor, even in the peak of summer when it hits close to 50 degrees outside, it's 27 degrees inside. So this is purely through this thermal massing of material up front. And that's what is Anita's idea of saying that when I paint in the studio, I should be able to flip the painting outside and it should become a mural for the public. Equally, I want to organize a mural on the outside of my building, flip it so that it becomes museum art. And that's this idea of politics in art, about whether art should be inside museums or out on the street. This was her statement for that, and this is how we interpreted it. These are various views. Interestingly, even the opening is a little difficult to... So she says, why should people stand at my doorstep? Why can't they take their shoes off and wet their feet in a pond and have a good time while they're waiting? Well, I told her about universal access and all that, but she said, wo dekh lenge baad mein. But yeah. And this is what she does every Thursday night. She holds cinema shows for her neighbors. Greater Noida is still being built, so her neighbors also include people who are building buildings, people who are off the street, who are going home, who are coming. There's a reason why this building has no boundary wall. It has steps, stepped green that leads down to that, is for this theatrical effect of being able to view cinema. So she became the curator of the Kochi Museurist Biennale in 2018, and she asked us to come and design the pavilion for the Kochi Museurist Biennale. And so the lesson over here is a lesson in, so that one was called Building Neighbors. This one's called Building Impermanence. So when Anita and I visited Cabral Yard in Kochi, for the first time we realized that here's a plot of land that used every 2 years. But after the 2 years, it's locked up. And then in 2 years, with the monsoons and the summer sun of Kerala, it gets completely taken over by foliage. So every time the pavilion is built, you're actually clearing ground. And then when we went in, we realized we could see archaeological evidence of previous pavilions. So pavilions from 2 years back, 4 years back, 8 years back. And Anita turned around to me and said, you know, actually, we shouldn't be building a pavilion at all. And I said, hang on, wait, then what happens to my portfolio? So she said that, you know, I want people to sit here and look at the skies through the... She talks like this, so you have to be able to understand what she's trying to say. She said, why should this be here? And I interpreted that as that, what if this was not here? What would happen after the Biennale? If our Biennale pavilion could just disappear without leaving any evidence of ever having arrived. So she said, yes, like a spaceship. It comes in, it lands, and it goes away. So I said, yeah, sure, like a spaceship. So the idea was, and I have to say, this is also a lesson in building impermanence, but also working with incredible partners. So we had the great fun of working with Manjunath, who's a structural engineer out of Bangalore. We had great fun working with a very young furniture design studio in Delhi called Studio Wood. And we had great fun working with the builders and makers. There's Appu Thomas, Pali, the bamboo worker, and his team from Kerala. All these guys, I have to say, worked at a time that was terrible for Kerala. This is just after the floods. In fact, a month before the pavilion had to be constructed, we didn't even know whether the Biennale was going to be on. That was the devastation. This site was flooded for 3 weeks before we could get access to it. So, in those contexts, I must say, this is also a pavilion that represents, to my mind, joint effort more than anything else. So the idea was to build, Manjunath is great with steel, so you can have these very complicated discussions and, you know, WhatsApp sketches in the middle of the night to each other about what the structure should be like. And he actually works with architects in that manner, in a sort of doodling manner. So, you know, to try and understand how trees work and how tree structure system works. How do you marry something like steel and bamboo together? Why do it? To do it in a way in which every piece of material that is put in here is actually you are able to dismantle and reuse and sell and buy, and therefore not just help with the construction cost, but also understand once you make a pole of steel, then that steel stays like that for 100 years. So you don't use steel if the pavilion is only going to be there for 3 months. Then after that, you have to think about what happens to the steel. Don't build in walls that have to then be buried in the ground and become archaeology. Build with cement boards that can, and detail it so that you can actually remove it, and the vendor who sold you the boards are happy to take them back. So while there is a small degradation in economic value, there's a long elongation in the life of the material. And that is what the lesson we learned about building impermanence, is to actually stretch the length of time material is used for through this. So this idea was to create rings of journeys into a building that is half underground, half overground, half transparent, half opaque, half air-conditioned, half not, to try and negotiate those things that we have problems with in black box theaters. Like right now, everything is shut. If one of you wants to talk, you can't. You'll be being rude to me. If one of you gets a phone call that you need to answer, you have to say, excuse me, excuse me, excuse me, and leave the room. So what if performances could happen with much less tension, where you could, if you wanted, to talk on the phone and watch something, you could. If you were outside enjoying the sea breeze, you could. If it was too hot and you wanted to go into the air-conditioned space, you could. So it's all about designing the circulation so that this can happen discreetly without creating disturbances to the performance. So that's really interestingly a little touched by Pali. So that little tokri at the bottom, that little detail, that actually represents rice harvest. It wasn't my detail. That's Pali's detail. And that's the last thing Pali put into place when he finished doing the bamboo work of the entire roof. I don't want to over-exotify it. I'm just saying that it's possible if you give light specifications to right people, then they will also contribute to the beauty of your structure and the poetry of what you're attempting. So that we also had a hip-hop cipher since you guys are youth. So, okay, so this is a project called Project Samman. This is a project that was a government project to build 120 community toilets in Odisha and Cuttack. The problem here is these were community toilets for places that are illegal on the map. And that has always been the problem with sanitation in this country. Thankfully, now there seems to be a lot more energy from the government in terms of building sanitation facilities as stopgaps. But please remember that everyone having access to their own toilet is almost like a fundamental right. That is one of the biggest divides we have in our society. It's not community, it's not like you provide public toilets and community toilets and the job is done. This is merely stopgap. This is only so that there can be a way of including those people to a situation where they get a water connection and a sewage connection, or have some way of, honorable defecation, to put a polite word to it. So this is a story of unequal water. Like I said, 120 sites, 12 typologies before parametric design. The idea was to actually sit and work out modules in which these toilets could be created. But most importantly, imagine what the impact of it would be under the toilet. That is, what is the sewage system? What is the sewage management system? I told Supriti and Neil a little story about this yesterday. I won't go into that. But the point is that you can't do piped sewage if you're building this. It has to be disaggregated. It has to be on-site. And you have to, Cuttack is below the Mahanadi water line. So every monsoon it floods. We went to sites where people were using toilets where you had water up to your chest. I've visited toilets in study for this where I could not imagine a worse form of hell in how you have to use that every day. And a lot of this design actually is saying that can we not reduce open defecation by just simply building toilets? Can we induce better, let's say, defecation behavior? Can we induce, this thing of telling children that they can go and, relieve themselves wherever, especially men, boys in this country. They grow up and they do that even when they're 40 years old. That whenever they want to take a leak, they just take a leak, right? That's because as children we said it was fine. Children don't go to community toilets because they're afraid. Because community toilets are unsafe. Women don't go because it's unsafe. So is it possible to design a toilet that is light, that is ventilated, that has all the things that the community needs to use that toilet? which includes sitting with the community, figuring out how they use toilets. For example, in Odisha, it's not about washing your hands after using the toilet, it's about washing your feet. So we had to design it's in the next slide, a stand where you can wash both hands and feet, because one of the mandates of the program was to induce better hand washing behavior. So we had to do that by creating a design for places where people could wash their feet and hands at the same time. How the billing happens. A lot of people feel they don't use toilets because they feel angry at the guys operating the toilets because they don't see them doing anything other than collect money from them. So to be able to see the guys actually maintain the toilets while you're waiting in queue, so that you know that there's quality where you're putting in money. These are all transactions we in the upper middle class demand from our service providers, but we don't have the design avenues to provide them below a certain income group, and that's where architecture can make a difference. We deployed systems of queuing up that are actually borrowed from how we queue up at airports to get boarding passes. It's no different. You line up and you wait for a turn where one door opens. Earlier toilets in Bhubaneswar, people would line up in front of individual stalls, get frustrated and break the door. So these are cycles that can be rethought and redesigned. To help people wash their hands after urinating, to design a hand washing system that goes with the urinal, and build that into specs that can be tendered. The biggest challenge is this is not some private contractor building it. It has to be built to cost to government specifications. It took 6 months to write the specifications to this project. They told us it would get built in 2 years. It took 7 years to build 97 so far out of the 120 toilets. So even with all good intentions, the systems we have to rethink are so deeply embedded that even when everyone agrees certain set of things are good ideas, it takes a lot of dedicated effort to push it through. Nothing that I have done. I finished my job after those 6 months, but it takes people in the municipal corporation, it takes people in the Housing and Urban Development Ministry, it takes people to drive this project through. And that's the result of that 97 things. I'll just end with this. I think this is my last. I hope it is. So Pakka is a collaborative that Anagram Architects is part of. You can find it online, pakka.in. We are trying to build base of the pyramid infrastructure in rural India using MP LADs, which are your MP Local Area Development Funds. There are certain caps to the project size. We don't attempt anything that goes beyond, say, 10 lakhs. These are to be able to build baseline infrastructure. I'll just run you through slideshow of what we did in Durgapur outside Bodh Gaya. So this is not really designed by Anagram Architects. The idea is to look for young people like you, people who are between taking a break after their college education or doing internships, to spend 3 months in a place, be guided by specialists and experts, how to develop a quick piece of infrastructure, coordinate with the MP's development funds in order to be able to build it. And the idea is to get in and get out quickly, not to build a dependency, to be able to build a certain way in which you can transfer enough technology so that those guys don't have to call their MP again and say, this is broken or that has to be fixed. They're able to do it themselves. Bodh Gaya is a tourist town, lots of plastic. This is the Mahadalit community in Durgapur outside Bodh Gaya. Many of them are rag pickers. So the idea was, could you build in masonry units made with compressed plastic? And those compressed plastic modules are actually built by an NGO, made by an NGO in Bihar, but they don't have a place to use them. It's just a product innovation they've done. And this happens when you work with local government, local MP. People have ideas. They tell you, can we build this guy in? Can we work with this? And it's possible to do baseline infrastructure like this in really short periods of time. And I mean, there's no reason why that has to happen on the flooring, but that happens because people themselves are proud of what they're building. So they will operate like designers on the ground. Final project, I think this one, it's Earthmade Gymnasium, it's ongoing. Similarly, it's a project in a place called Malakpur. Malakpur is called the village of wrestlers in western UP, Baraut. And this idea of building know-how. So the youth in Malakpur, so Malakpur is located very close to Delhi, just beyond Delhi and Meerut. That's the site. You can see sugarcane farming. That dark brown patch is the village of Malakpur and the red is the site in that area. The youth of this area wrestling is a way of life. Kushti, Pahalwani, It's not just men, it's also increasingly women. And it's actually evidence of a sort of connection to the soil. There's a lot of ritualization of body and soil, the connection between body and soil in how Indian wrestling actually works. The problem is, these youth from that village don't find avenues to their wrestling. So even though they're so close to Delhi, they all want to become part of the national team, international team, the wrestling federation, so on and so forth. But they don't have mats. That's the only reason why they don't make it. So 100 youth will go from this village to the city of Delhi to become part of an akhada, to get into the national stadium, to be able to wrestle on mats. 99 of them will come back broken-limbed, broken-hearted, broken-souled, and just one person may make it big. And that journey is extremely painful to the body and the mind. They resort to drugs in order to enhance their performances. After they fail, they're still hooked onto drugs. They like staying in the city because it's easy money as muscle for power. In a city like Delhi, you can imagine, their muscle on hire. They become bouncers and basically become the criminal underbelly of the city of Delhi. So the elders in Malakpur got together and they said, look, if we can get mats in the village, we can prevent these boys from going bad, they said. Bigad nahi jayenge. So the idea was, can we build, and this is using the local MP funds, is it possible? So that's Subhash Pahalwan. He is a 1982 Asiad bronze winning wrestler. He's also a Pahalwan, but he was at that time a wannabe politician. He wanted to be the local MLA. And those are the Taus of Barot. They are the panchayat that runs the village of Malakpur. That's that old panchayat structure. And they basically said, we want to build in a way that we can keep the boys here under our scrutiny. And if you think about it, these guys at age 12 go and live in a hostel and they stay there till they're 25. So how do we expect any form of understanding of this whole family breakdown, genders, how do you look at women, how do women look at you? What is it that, that whole thing gets warped just because they are living in a city, in a hostel, spending all their time just boys with boys. So this idea was to build in a way that kind of links to how Pahalwans work, which is connect to the land. There's this whole process by which they dig the soil, prepare the ground before every session of Dangal. And to say that, is that possible, then can we look for technologies in rammed earth that help them build infrastructure in that way? And then once a certain structure has been created, can that technology then remain with these wrestlers so that when each of them decides to open, when they are 40 or 50, their own academy, their own akhada, then they are able to do that without calling someone and saying we want to build with mats. So very simple structure made out of rammed earth, simple standalone walls, then covered with a roof structure that's actually derived from our Kochi structure. Little detailing so that becomes part of the rhythm of making the wall rather than treating it as a facade that is specific to a building. Provide ideas that can work in section, in detail section, in external wall section, and can plug in, and you understand, and the person building it understands why this is being deployed there, and not just in because it looks good. So I'll just end with this. So to my mind, there are 6 things for us to think about if we have to think about rethink architecture, and this is what I call the disaggregations of resilience. First is consider streets as sites. As architects, we very rarely consider roads and streets as sites. We don't even think our buildings contribute to the architecture of the street or the road. It's important to think of that. The second is to look at consumption as being scattered and therefore resource tapping, resource production as not being centralized. I like photovoltaics. Disaggregated, scattered energy creation, resource creation for living, not just for architecture. Think about material afterlives. That plastic bottle is now going to be around for 1,000 years once it's made. That's an actual photograph. So that plastic bottle is not going to die for another 1,000 years. The ceramic bottle next to it can be regenerated within 20 or 30 years. So choose materials in that manner. Both of them are available on Amazon, by the way. The fourth is multivocal. We all have concepts. We all say things through our designs. But can we make designs that allow other people to speak? Can they Can that design mean something differently to them but have enough value? Even if that's not your value, if it's that person's value. Build reservoirs. So resources are depleting at an unimaginable scale. If we have to survive as a species on this planet and not be responsible for the destruction of this planet, then we need to go back into building reservoirs, not just of water, of knowledge, of craft, of material, of thinking about material as something that you borrowed and has to go back, right? Like a library book, you need to give it back. You can't just imagine it's yours forever. And then finally, self-build. As specifiers, as people who make complicated drawings of technologies and exciting engineering systems, can we communicate that in a way in which it empowers people to imagine a reality where they could build? After all, we all cook for us. I mean, most of us do. Cook for ourselves. It's not so strange to have to build for yourself. Is it possible for us to make our design output in a manner that it's not a special set of skills you need to read what is happening? Can we communicate that simply, easily to achieve built goals? I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Architect Madhav Raman. It was a great pleasure to listen to you. The projects are experimental in nature, and each project is developed with a distinct and independent framework. And all of us here had a good chance to experience your project through you. Thank you for sharing your projects along with us. Now we move to the question and answer session, where Architect Akshay Hiranchal and Architect Madhav Raman will answer the questions from the audience. As we have a limited time, so we'll take only 4 to 5 questions. And whoever has a question, please raise your hand. And before you put your question, please give a small introduction of yours. And I request the volunteers to please help with the mic. If anyone has a question, please. Yes. Volunteers? Yes.
Hello everyone. I'm Ankit Kumar, a 4th year student from BIT Mesra. So my question is basically from every architect here. Like, why still most of the houses built in India are not designed by an architect? Like, what I've seen is majorly workers or the contractor design themselves. So why is this gap between the architects and the clients, and in small towns and villages, and what we can do to tackle this situation? Thank you.
So, sir, yeah. You can answer from there itself. Volunteers, please help.
You want to answer, Akshay? So I can only say what I said at the end. I think a lot of this has to do with not so much how complicated our ideas are, but in how we actually are able to, who we think are the agents who are going to build designs. We restrict ourselves to practicing in cities. There's no reason why we can't practice in a village. The only thing preventing us is like a language barrier. We don't talk the language in the language that needs to be built in. And that's also a money language. We don't specify things in a money language that makes sense. We don't specify things in a material language that... We approach villages, and therefore people who live in rural India consider people who are from cities who come to build in their areas. Almost like we are, the British. They are a strange animal that comes in with this Aflatun idea that just gets made and then they go away and then it's amazing after that. It doesn't work like that. We have to go and put ourselves in that context, imagine what building there means to those people, and be able to have that ability to talk in that language to them. So we specify material, we make drawings. It has to be from there if it has to. So if you are from here in Ranchi, then you should, I guess, try and understand how folks build around here. And similarly, then wherever you go to build, if you go to Bangalore, Hyderabad, Delhi, Punjab, you have to take the time to understand what building means there. Who are these contractors? Who are the laborers these contractors hire? We always say brick mason, but there is no brick masonry in South India, and yet you see these guys from Bangalore and Kerala pulling off these amazing... So it's not like technologies can't transfer, but someone has to take the care and effort to transfer it and not expect it to be there when we go outside big cities. You?
Do we have any more questions? Okay.
Madhav, a question for you. Sorry, I'm not a young architect, but you know, in the first. Okay, I should have gone and sat at the back and asked you the question. You know, in the first project that you showed, it was a project you did on the fringe of, I think you said, Humayun Nagar.
Humayunpur.
And there was a open space that you said nobody used. So, I mean, in your experience, after you've built it and after you've seen it, why do you think it was a space unused by both sections of society?
It's like Wagah border. It's an edge in the city that no one crosses. So people will go to use that. You see like when you see a master plan green, designated green in the master plan with a residential colony around it, it's also allocated in the sense, oh, there are 50,000 people here who will use that one park, and so we've allocated that park. But actually what ends up happening is there's an awful lot of, no one uses the park. So very few people actually, the kids don't play there or they don't play together there. They have strict timings of which part of the park is used by which part of the community. So the formal colony, there's no one from the formal colony uses that green. Humayunpur has, my sense is, having spent time there, my sense is those folks use it as a viewing gallery of the formal colony. They just look, they sit there and they stare. They don't use it. They don't recreate in it. And these are, I think, unfortunately, divisions in society along income groups, along communities, along classes, that I don't know whether it's architecturally possible to address, but it's definitely architecturally possible to recognize. And I think the biggest blunder we do is we perhaps like to paper over these uncomfortable things, you know?
Yeah, I would think it would be a facilitator for, you know, sections to use, but if that doesn't happen, then you really wonder what really facilitates.
I'll tell you what, a typical green like this in Delhi could be a place where people would come together if that park was used as a pandal or as a Durga Puja place or to, you know, Ravan Dahan or, you know, place where, because I remember as a child, everyone would come and watch these things happen. But as pandals become more elaborate, as Durga Pujas become more elaborate, at Ravan, you know, these Ramlila things become more elaborate, these small parks don't get used for that either. So there's actually that idea that just by putting a green, people will come and use it together is not an assumption we can make anymore. And we need to work, I think, harder to make that happen if that's the intention, you know, as design, through design. But again, I strongly don't believe we can address at a major way sociological problems through architecture. We can bear witness. I think we can stand and bear witness and say something happened. I mean, this park should have been this, but is not this. Whether through architecture or by talking about it. I genuinely feel that.
Yeah, okay. It was a strange phenomenon, I mean, I thought.
Thank you, Madhav. Sorry, friends, we have a limited amount of time for this session, so we'll move forward. As we know that the architects are around, we can utilize the day's time to interact with them. With the extremely interesting session which we had today, we would like to thank our speakers to ignite the young minds with the bright and innovative projects. It was truly a perfect blend of traditional and contemporary ideas. Now it's time that we extend our gratitude to our speakers on behalf of Indian Institute of Jharkhand Architects Jharkhand chapter. I request architect Lalichand Zakaria's IA council member to kindly come forward up on the stage to felicitate architect Akshay Hiranjal. Sir, please come forward. Thank you. Next, I would like to call upon stage Architect Akshay Beria, IA Council member, to kindly come forward and felicitate Architect Madhav Raman.